Well, something interesting is happening in the Arctic this week, and it's one of those stories that looks small on the surface, but actually says a lot about where this world is heading.
Prime Minister Mark Carney is traveling to Norway to meet with Nordic leaders and to observe NATO's cold response military exercise above the Arctic Circle. That exercise involves about 25,000 troops from 14 countries training together in some of the harshest conditions on the planet.
And while that sounds like a routine military drill, the context right now makes it much more significant. Because the Arctic used to be treated like a remote part of the map where scientists studied ice and polar bears, but now it's becoming one of the most strategically important regions on Earth.
And before Prime Minister Carney even flew to Norway, he made a stop in Yellowknife in Canada's Northwest Territories. He spent the afternoon announcing a new plan to strengthen Canada's Arctic and Northern region. Now, on the surface, that might sound like two unrelated events, but they're actually the same story.
Because the Arctic is no longer that quiet corner of the world where the biggest drama involves icebreakers and research stations. Shipping routes are opening up as the ice melts. Countries are competing for access to minerals, energy, and territory. Russia has heavily militarized its Arctic coastline. China has declared itself a near-Arctic state. And lately, we all know the United States has been creating a lot of tension in the region.
So when the Canadian Prime Minister travels to Norway to stand with Nordic leaders and NATO commanders, it's not a sightseeing trip. It's about sovereignty.
So let's start with what happened in Yellowknife. Carney announced a new plan aimed at defending and developing Canada's North and Arctic region. He also met with Northwest Territories Premier R.J. Simpson and toured local infrastructure before flying out later that evening for Norway.
Which tells you the message Ottawa wanted to send. Arctic policy doesn't start in European conference rooms. It starts in our northern communities.
And that point actually matters more than most people realize. One of the big concerns experts keep raising about Canada's Arctic sovereignty isn't that another country is about to invade. It's that Canada hasn't invested enough in the North for decades. Housing shortages, limited infrastructure, expensive food, transportation challenges. If people living in the North feel forgotten, then sovereignty becomes harder to defend.
One former Canadian ambassador to Norway said this week that neglect could be a bigger threat to Canada's Arctic sovereignty than Russia or China. Now, that's a pretty blunt statement, but the logic is simple. You can't claim ownership of a region while ignoring the people who live there.
So the stop in Yellowknife wasn't just symbolic. It was part of a bigger shift in how Canada is thinking about the Arctic, because the Arctic is changing, physically and politically. The high north looks less like a remote wilderness and more like a strategic crossroads.
And that's one reason Canada is paying so much attention to what Nordic countries have been doing. Norway, Sweden, Finland, Denmark, and Iceland have spent decades investing heavily in their northern regions. Infrastructure, healthcare, education, transportation, military readiness. In many ways, they've treated their Arctic territories as core parts of the country, not distant outposts.
And Canada is now trying to play catch-up. That stop included a $35 billion investment in northern defense and infrastructure, funding aimed at improving military capability, transportation networks, communication systems, and community development across Canada's Arctic. Think roads, housing, infrastructure, communications, military capability. All of that has lagged behind all those other Arctic countries.
And that's why Carney's visit to Norway is significant. It will actually be the first official visit by a Canadian Prime Minister to Norway since 1980. Think about that for a second. More than 4 decades without a Prime Minister making an official visit to one of the world's most important Arctic nations. That tells you how much Canada's priorities have shifted.
And once Carney arrives in Norway, he'll meet with Norwegian Prime Minister Jonas Gahr Store and German Chancellor Friedrich Merz before observing the cold response exercises in Bardufoss.
Well done, Dave. Those were some hard words to say. The exercise itself happens every 2 years, and it's designed to test how NATO countries would operate together in Arctic conditions. That's in meaning land forces, naval operations, aircraft special forces, cold weather, rough terrain, long supply lines, the kind of environment where preparation really matters.
And we all know preparation matters even more right now because the geopolitical environment is changing so quickly. Finland and Sweden both joined NATO recently after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. That expanded NATO's presence dramatically across Northern Europe, and suddenly the entire Arctic flank of the alliance has become much more important.
Now, Canada has been pushing NATO to take the Arctic more seriously for years. Now that alliance is doing exactly that, and Carney's presence at these exercises send a signal that Canada wants to be fully involved in shaping the strategy and future.
So basically, part of what Carney is doing in Norway is reinforcing relationship with Nordic countries. He's expected to meet with leaders from Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Finland, and Iceland at what's being called a Nordic-Canada Summit. The conversation will focus on defense cooperation, Arctic security, trade, energy, and investment. But there's also a deeper strategic idea behind it, Deb.
Yeah, Carney talked about this during his famous speech in Davos earlier this year. He argued that so-called middle-power countries like Canada, Norway, Japan, Australia, they need to work together more closely because the global system is becoming less predictable. And frankly, that's a polite way of saying something many countries are already thinking. They cannot rely on the United States the way they used to.
Especially when Trump is threatening allies. Just this week, he referred to Mark Carney as the future governor in a social media post, implying that Canada should eventually become part of the United States. And he's also previously threatened to annex Greenland, which is the territory of Denmark. That kind of rhetoric has made so many NATO countries nervous, and for good reason.
So when Nordic leaders invite the Canadian Prime Minister to stand with them at a major Arctic military exercise, it sends a strong signal. The Arctic isn't up for grabs. The countries that actually live there are coordinating their security, and Canada is finally a part of that group.
But defense isn't the only topic that's on the agenda. Another major part of this trip is investment. Norway operates one of the largest sovereign wealth funds in the world, built from decades of oil and gas revenue. Now, that fund controls enormous pools of capital. So when Canadian officials talk about attracting investment from the Nordic region, they're talking about serious money here.
Yeah, they are openly talking about attracting investment from that fund into projects in Canada. Money that could go into things like northern infrastructure, critical minerals, clean energy, AI, and defense manufacturing. Canada's federal government has already committed more than $80 billion in defense spending over the coming years. And part of that money is going into a new defense industrial strategy, and the Arctic is expected to play a major role in that strategy.
Because when you look at a map, Canada's Arctic territory is enormous. And as ice conditions change, shipping routes through the Arctic Ocean could become more active. And that means more commercial activity, more strategic competition, and more pressure on Canada to monitor and protect that space, which requires everything from satellites, ships, aircraft, to strong alliances.
Now, there's also a political backdrop to all of this, and that story unfolded in Ottawa earlier this week. While Carney was preparing for his trip, Nunavut MP Lori Idlout crossed the floor from the NDP party to join the Liberal government.
Floor crossings always trigger debate in Canada. Some people think that MPs should resign and run again if they switch parties. Others argue that voters elect individuals, not just party labels. And our parliamentary system actually allows MPs to move between parties if they believe it serves their constituents.
Idlout herself said the decision came down to exactly that. She said feedback from people in Nunavut convinced her that she could do more for them by joining the governing party. At one point, she said that staying with the NDP began to feel like she was betraying the people she represents. Now, that is a powerful statement.
It definitely is. Nunavut politics also work differently than much of southern parts of Canada. The territory has only about 42,000 residents spread across a region larger than many countries, really. In territorial politics, there aren't even political parties. The legislature operates under a consensus system where members run as individuals. So many voters in Nunavut often vote for individuals they know personally rather than focusing heavily on party affiliation.
And Idlout herself comes from the Inuit community of Igloolik and has worked on issues like suicide prevention, food insecurity, and protecting traditional hunting grounds. She narrowly won her seat in the last election by just 41 votes. So she has a very direct relationship with her constituents. When they tell her that they want stronger representation inside the government, she has to take that seriously.
So her relationship with constituents is extremely direct. And she said many of those constituents, they urged her to join the government because they believed that she could accomplish more for Nunavut from inside the governing party.
Another factor is the state of the NDP. After the last election, the party was reduced to just 7 MPs, which means it lost official party status in Parliament. That makes it much harder to influence legislation or to get issues onto the national agenda. So Idlout faced a very difficult choice.
Stay in a small opposition caucus with limited influences, or move into the governing party where she might have more direct access to decision makers.
And there's also a broader political reality here. Since Mark Carney became prime minister, his government has gained in popularity a lot. People across the political spectrum appear to believe that the Liberals may win the next election comfortably. So joining the government now could improve an MP's position in re-elections later.
Idlout's move also has a practical effect inside Parliament. With her crossing, the Liberal government now holds 170 seats in the House of Commons. A majority government requires 172. So the Liberals are now just 2 seats short of a majority.
And there are 3 by-elections coming soon. In other countries, they call them special elections. 2 of those ridings are widely considered strong Liberal territory, so it's entirely possible that the government could reach majority status without a full general election. And that's another feature of Canada's parliamentary system that sometimes surprises outside people. Power can shift gradually inside the House of Commons, but it doesn't always require a national vote.
Which actually makes parliamentary systems more flexible than presidential systems. And in a strange way, that flexibility is actually a strength. In the United States, once a president is elected, the country is effectively locked into that leadership until the next election cycle, unless something extreme happens.
In parliamentary systems, caucuses can push out leaders, governments can fall through confidence votes, and MPs can change party affiliations. It can look messy from the outside, but it allows the system to adapt more quickly when circumstances change.
And circumstances right now are changing very, very quickly. Global tensions are rising, the energy markets are unstable because of all the conflicts in the Middle East, Russia's war in Ukraine continues, and the Arctic is becoming a focal point for defense and economic competition.
So when you look at the week as a whole, you can see 2 stories happening at the same time. On the international stage, Canada is strengthening alliances in the Arctic with Nordic countries and NATO partners. And at home, the government is consolidating political support inside Parliament. Which matters because the decisions Canada makes in the next few years about the Arctic, defense spending, and international alliances will shape the country's strategic position for decades. Those decisions require political stability. They require governments that can pass budgets and legislation, and they require MPs who believe they can actually deliver results for their regions.
The bigger story is that Canada is slowly redefining its role in the world.
Yep, a country that used to focus mainly on trade and diplomacy is now being forced to think much more seriously about defense, sovereignty, and alliances.
You know, in a world where geography is becoming strategic again, the North may turn out to be one of the most important parts of Canada's future. And judging by the trip to Norway this week, Ottawa is really starting to realize that.
Now, before we wrap up, we want to say a quick thank you. Our new travel channel, The Planet D Travel, just crossed 1,000 subscribers. It's a small number compared to this channel, but it's a big milestone for a new start. So thanks to everyone who jumped on over there and subscribed.
And if you want to support what we're doing here, make sure to check the pinned comment below this video because you'll find links to our Substack, our private Facebook group, the merch store, and of course, the A-Team if you want to help keep this channel going. So that'll do it for us for today. Thanks again for watching, everybody, and we'll see you tomorrow.